Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I am your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you ever think about drugs, you ever wonder about medical devices, you consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I do these podcasts because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself talking to really smart people like today's guest, and I find myself learning something new each time. So it would be nice, however, if I knew that someone else was listening. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me and reach out to me on Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our guest today, our podcast today is going to be amazing. We're actually going to end up talking with we're going to talk about privacy. We're going to talk about ad tech, which is a term that I've heard before, but it's one of those things that it's so industry specific. So I'm excited to actually see how that word is starting to shape what we're going to talk about, which is the public policy around advertising, about technology around it, and specifically around privacy today. So I'm really excited to have with us the VP of Public Policy at the Network Advertising Initiative at AI, and that is Mr. David LeDuc. David, pleasure to have you on. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Darshan. I think this is a fun talk. I'm looking forward to it as well.
So this is going to be really fun because what I want to find out about is, let's actually start with your role. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what that means at NAI.
Yeah, well, so the NAI, the Network Advertising Initiative, is a self-regulatory and trade association for digital advertising companies, particularly those that are in what we call the third-party ad tech space. But we're actually a two-pronged organization. We've been around for 20 years, believe it or not, in the self-reg game for digital advertising, pretty much since the beginning of digital advertising. And over the last 5 or so years, as public policy has become more focused on privacy, on consumer privacy, and digital advertising, the NAI expanded its mission and became more engaged in public policy. And as the VP for public policy at the NAI, I came on, I guess, almost 3 years ago, and really with the goal of helping to educate policymakers about the industry, because it's such a complex thing, and no normal person knows a darn thing about digital advertising. Really, they just kind of get ads and wonder why they're getting them, where they're coming from, et cetera. So, a huge part of what we do and keeping the space effective, we feel like, is educating and engaging on public policy, promoting a federal law that can provide for a national privacy standard rather than having a patchwork of state laws, which unfortunately we're beginning to see. So that's my ballgame, is really that part of the organization, is the educating and advocacy and engagement with policymakers.
So what I'm hearing, David, for lack of a better term, is the idea that you find yourself at this moment really talking to a bunch of different states and going, here's what you guys should be considering. If you're already considering a privacy bill, here's what you should be considering. But I kind of feel like I just put words in your mouth when I said that. In that, do you reach out to them when they've already started, or do you reach out to them to begin putting something in place? How does that process work for you?
Well, that's a good question. And in terms of legislative advocacy, especially at the state level, it's really done in two ways. I mean, if you're proactively trying to get laws in a certain area, you might proactively go to states that hadn't even thought about something and start planting seeds, engaging with them. I mean, that's how the legislative process works, right? We're more in a reactive position, to be honest, which is, I mean, I don't know if many of your viewers know, but everyone in our space knows that it's just a really hot area at the state, at state legislatures, just to focus on consumer privacy. And so we're more reactive. We're spending time monitoring, figuring out which states are the most serious, and engaging with them. I mean, we don't have a lot of resources, and so we do what we can to educate as many states. And we tend to, it's kind of like triage. We tend to focus on the ones that need, are furthest along, or most serious about moving something. And we do spend a lot of time encouraging them not to act, because we'd, like, as I mentioned, we'd rather see a federal bill. Not many people think that I don't know if anyone really thinks this, but the notion that if you have a handful of state laws that are different, pretty significantly different on an issue such as consumer privacy, that's a good approach. I mean, so not many people. I mean, most policymakers don't really think that's a good approach. Most consumers, when you talk to people, they're like, well, that doesn't sound like a right approach. Businesses hate it because it's a compliance nightmare. You've got disparate laws. And at the end of the day, it's I think intellectually almost everybody agrees, like, yeah, that's not a great idea, But we have this bigger problem to some extent, even bigger than us in this country, which is Congress's ability to legislate, right? I mean, that's not a secret. So in the absence of that, I think, as many people know, the focus really shifts to state legislatures, and state legislatures pick up the ball in many areas. This has been, this has been the case in regulation across industry. In California is quite often the leader, whether it's around fuel efficiency and pollution, environmental regulations. A state like California, being very progressive, tends to lead, and they led several years ago with the California Consumer Privacy Act, known as the CCPA, and that pretty much kicked it off. And now a whole bunch of states are looking at privacy legislation, copycats, but mutated versions. Many states are looking at new hybrid versions that kind of blend in components from the European data privacy law, the general data privacy regulation. So it's like a big canvas out there in the states to enact, a bunch of different laws. And so our primary message is like, thanks, but it's not a great idea. And while at the same time, we're pushing Congress to actually do something and hopefully making progress.
So that's kind of interesting to me on multiple fronts. So the first front I think that's interesting is the idea that you're telling states not to do anything. And on one hand, I 100% get where you're coming from, which is if states start doing it, Congress is going to punt that as long as they possibly can, because then they don't have to make a decision on something. On the other hand, what I'm also seeing is someone might argue, if you say don't do it, it means I go without protections for longer. Which how does that thought process play in how you decided which direction to go? Because what I'm hearing you say is you're not saying we don't need these laws. You're saying we don't need them at a patchwork level. We need them at a cohesive, comprehensive level. But I imagine that it must bring a certain amount of bad press, or at least bad pushback from people saying, but what about right now? What about my needs as a consumer? So I don't know if that's a question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. And it's a fair one. I mean, and to be honest, the notion of us saying, you shouldn't try to advance anything, it falls on deaf ears, So, I mean, that's our perspective, but we frankly don't even say that very much because legislatures say, we're going to do this, and they want to do it. The people we're talking to are pretty committed to do it. And it's not terribly effective to just say, nah, the feds, they got this in Congress. Don't worry about it, because you're exactly right. Because they'll say those guys can't do anything, So that's just silly. So we frankly don't even trot that out all that much, because we know they're committed, and it ends up being engagement with them saying, okay, well, here's what you got. Here's what we have in the other states, as some of. Here's how it impacts various companies. Here's how it impacts us. This is what's good in those other laws. This is what's bad in those other laws. To the extent that you can align yourself with these other laws, that's good. That provides for consistency. To the extent that you're going to go in a different direction, enact a totally different statute with different definitions, that's not so good, And so it's really just a matter of that at this point. And in some cases, it's particularly frustrating because we're asking them in some cases to align with statutes that we don't really like and don't agree with, but they're there, like they're not, like the CCPA isn't a great model. It focuses on the sale of data, not the use of it or the outcomes or the harms, just the sale, and gives consumers the opportunity to opt out of the sale, which presupposes that like that's the bad thing there. Like a company gets data, they sell it in a really broadly defined way, and that's what's bad. Like that's what consumers should be afraid about is, and so it's this false notion that, well, a first party company that actually collects your data, like Facebook or someone else, is great. They don't have to sell your data at all. They just get gobs of it on their own, and they just use it and do different things with it, and that's fine. But for smaller companies, publishers, news publishers, others on the web that work with our members and collect data, and ultimately in what is a sharing ecosystem, are caught up in a lot of the protections and stuff. So it makes for a sticky environment, and like what happens so often, it ends. We're in a situation now where these laws end up benefiting the biggest companies, and some of the companies that policymakers really don't like, for right or wrong. Most policymakers don't like Facebook, as we see in the news. And it's just so, but they end up, because it's so difficult, and it's not really a criticism of any of them. It's really difficult to craft laws in ways that don't provide for an incumbent advantage for giant corporations that have certain business models, and so that's kind of where we're at. And we do a lot of educating about that and trying to inform them how and that's where my role is really important in trying to help explain how ad tech works. What are the benefits of digital advertising and the ways that it's done. But at the same time, we are self-reg, and we're the strongest privacy advocates within the industry. How they can enact laws that'll be strong, but more balanced.
It's funny you talk about. There are two different things that really popped out at me as you were talking. The first one was this idea that. And you drew this distinction between first party and third party advertising laws and privacy laws, if you will. But it, to me, is exactly reflective of the argument that's still going on, I believe, in California, especially around Facebook versus Apple. And the idea that Apple is basically saying, I protect your privacy, and everyone's sort of hailing Apple for that wonderful thing of saying we protect your privacy, ignoring the fact that what Apple is really saying is only we have access to your data. We'll do whatever we want with it, but we just won't sell it to Facebook if they want it. Which, don't get me wrong, I have issues with that anyways. But the idea that it's framed so that Apple is the hero is an interesting argument to me. At least that's how it's been positioned for me. What is your take on something like that? And I don't necessarily. Well, I just want to be clear. Today's talk really represents your opinions. It doesn't necessarily represent what NAI's take on anything is. Is that fair? Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely fair. Yeah. But
yeah, what is your take on the Apple versus Facebook argument? And are they? Is Apple more right, if that's the correct term?
It's a tricky question. I think it's fair. It's fair to have competition on privacy, right? And that's something policymakers want. It's something consumers want. We all want companies to be able to differentiate themselves in the marketplace by doing things that benefit their customers and to achieve good outcomes. So starting with that, okay, so Apple wants to go down that path. They want to protect privacy, as defined. And privacy is a different thing; means different things to different people.
Are they even actually protecting privacy? They're just saying that we want to control your privacy, not protect your privacy.
Right. Yeah. No. And that's what we're seeing. I think a lot of what Apple does. And Apple does a whole bunch of different things. I think what's been in the news most recently has been the opt-in for tracking across apps, and we're not even concerned about that in terms of if you want to have an opt-in, for apps to access the identifier. We're not overly concerned with that. Actually, we think that could be an acceptable model. Opt-in isn't. Although it's not ideal for consumers, and we don't really believe that it's an effective framework. I don't think many people think that consumers actually want to see notices everywhere and then have to, accept or deny them. But, I think the notion of having that isn't a bad thing. That particularly us. Am I still here? My computer's
You broke up there for a second for me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's probably my internet connection. I'm not sure why. I have good internet connection, but it always seems to freeze on me whenever I'm doing these talks.
Right.
I apologize. So could you repeat the last sentence or so for me?
Yeah, so with Apple, I mean, we're not inherently opposed to opt-in and think that it can be done in the right way, and for the right types of data. And in this case, it's not a bad thing necessarily, but the way that they've labeled everything as tracking, making it sound worse than it is in many cases, and then having a terms of service that's even more broad. And most people don't know this, and it's unfortunate. Effectively, creating terms of service, a policy for all the apps in their ecosystem, that you can't even, if a person has not accepted to be tracked, a company like the New York Times can't even know that it's them, because I'm a subscriber, right? So they know who David LeDuc is because I'm authenticated. I've logged in. I've signed up for their terms. I'm a subscriber. They can't even use what they know about me, or use the fact they know my email address. They know where I live. They can't even target regional ads or ads to my interest based on what I'm reading or any of that. So outside of anything iOS unique, they can't even do any of those things because of Apple's rules. So these rules on tracking that are well intended at some level to prevent collection of people's data broadly across the ecosystem, ends up being a lot more onerous, and we think really runs into and potentially conflicts with their role in the marketplace, being a duopolist. The notion that a duopolist who benefits from apps being sold, or in-app purchases, right? And so apps are monetized in three ways, really. They're primarily monetized through the data collection and use, and for our ecosystem, the digital advertising industry helps to monetize, and it helps publishers actually pay for those apps because they don't usually charge for them, and there's not usually in-app purchases. And those are the two places where Apple makes money. So the fact that they're extending policies somewhat invisibly to policymakers and people, and most consumers, they're extending these policies in ways that essentially limit valuable advertising and even responsible and valuable uses of data, in some cases that have been consented, isn't good for the ecosystem, and it's likely to drive the ecosystem towards apps being, for fee-based apps, and in-app purchases, and then surprise, Apple gets a 30% cut on those things. So that's why I think people are looking at Apple saying like, I mean, if they weren't a duopolist and had a lot of skin in the game, in the competing business models, people wouldn't really think anything of it. But the fact they stand to make a tremendous amount of revenue, and then they were just asked in a recent hearing how much. Tim Cook was asked how much money they make from their app store, and he didn't know. Like he said, I don't know, we make, which is just crazy that Apple doesn't know how much money it makes in its app store. It just, we sell phones and we don't really know if we're making money over here. No one really buys that. But I mean, so the point being, competition on privacy is a good thing if it's done in the right way. But it's tricky, because it's a tricky thing to do. To do well, and it's tricky to set any rules or practices and assume that the consumers feel the same way and want the same things, because people are different and have different wants and needs.
So here's a question that I haven't fully understood. While Apple took a position and Facebook took a position, Google tried to stay out of it for the most part. Why is that?
Well, Google's in the, they're a big ad tech player. Apple has not significantly made money in advertising. They've tried a number of times. They dove in headfirst and didn't succeed in the past. And, so their history is a little inconsistent with saying we love privacy, going back to Steve Jobs, and we don't want to collect your data. But at various times they ventured into that. Google is unabashedly a data-driven innovation company. I mean, I think in their fiber, Google admittedly says that we believe in the value of data collection and use and responsible use, and and they're going to still be in that business. So I think they're inherently very different companies, and most people don't realize that either. Like that's where Google makes all their money is in advertising, and not all of it, but the lion's share. Most of it's in search advertising, but then after that, a substantial amount is in other types of digital advertising and monetizing data, and that's a good thing, and that's why all these products are free too, right? Like, I mean, everyone gets Gmail, and everyone gets all these great things, and Google Maps, and it's all free, and that's why it's a little frustrating to us when people say, we should get paid for the use of our data, and I just want to say, like, well, will you wake up? Like, everything you get that's free, like everyone has so much great free stuff, and it's unbelievable. The parking apps and everything. It's like everybody's lives have been made so much better over the last 10 years, unless they're lying to themselves. They're getting all these new and cool benefits, and they're all almost totally free. And they're driven by data, and then so it's frustrating to us, and we want the data to be used responsibly, and that's where we come in, and that's one of our primary objectives. But the notion that we just need to stop this, and the consumers somehow there's not a fair trade. I mean, to be honest, I think our industry hasn't done a good job with respect to informing about the value exchange, right? Like when you're sharing your data, you're getting free products and services. You're getting free or low cost news across the web, and all these great apps you have with all this information, and and the various different services, and the free word processing, and the email, and the list is long. There's a trade-off, and those things are monetized with data-driven advertising and marketing. The better we can do at educating people and letting them know that, the more they say, oh, well, okay. Because then when you ask them, and we've done this in surveys, if you ask them, would you rather do this and have data-driven advertising, or would you rather pay, like a couple bucks a month, and which would end up being a lot of money when you add it up across everything people are getting. They by and large say, yeah, oh yeah, I'd much rather get it for free, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, that's not really a concern, but it's when they're confused and they just hear like, oh, my data is being collected and used. I don't know about that. I don't know why that's happening. So some of that's on us, as an industry, and that's, partially my job to at least educate policymakers and other thought leaders about how the ecosystem works, the value that we provide, the value that data-driven advertising provides, to help reset that mind, the whole frame of mind. And so Google, I mean, I'm meandering a bit in your question. Google, it comes from a different place, and ultimately, but we expect that they will quite possibly follow Apple in the app tracking policy business, but probably differently. Google tends to take a more thoughtful approach on these things. They announced a little over a year ago about the deprecation of third-party cookies, as we call it, the notion that in their Chrome browser, which has the lion's share of user base, they won't support third-party cookies any longer, which are the technology they use to track people from site to site and help gather data about browsing data, and that's fair too. That's another thing that we haven't said, hey, that's crazy. You should keep cookies, third-party cookies, and I think many of us believe that third-party cookies have been unfortunately a bit opaque and hard to control, and there's a lot of companies out there that can use them, and so it's not crazy to stop honoring and supporting third-party cookies and to move away from them. That's something we support, but we want to be able to replace it with something that can help provide the value and provide for effective data-driven advertising. It can do that broadly rather than just, what we don't want is a shift so that only 3, 4, 5 companies have all the data and can make all the money, and then the small guys, less of the money will drip down to the small guys. The small ad tech companies go out of business. Publishers and advertisers start paying more because they've got less channels to go through. And at the end of the day, publishers and the creators make less. So that's the balance that I think most people understand when they think about it, and we don't want to have. We don't want to have just a couple companies doing all this stuff.
So just by the way, we just got a comment from Lydia Green. Hey, Lydia, how are you? She agrees with you. Consumers do not understand the value of access to free apps and search. So 100%, we already have people listening live and agreeing with you. So yeah. So the question that I have that goes along with this is the idea that as consumers, as you said, according to surveys, we're okay with being tracked as long as it doesn't cost us money. From the NAI's perspective, and again, you're not speaking necessarily officially in their position, but the thought process is what I'm more curious about. Where does the end of when does advertising stop, and when does behavioral science begin? And what I mean by that is advertising is almost a reminder: do this, or we think you should do that. On the other hand, nudging using behavioral science really takes it to that next level, which is this is the right moment to sort of change your perspective and suggest you act. Does NEI even get into regulating something like that? Is there any organization that does? And what is how do you do that responsibly? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes sense. I think it's a bit. It's not crazy. I think it's a bit futuristic. But it's totally fair, and it's the way that some people are thinking already. The notion of when advertising becomes too good, and the term for this is there's a term for this called loss of autonomy. The notion that people will lose their autonomy because the other entities that know so much about them will become so smart that they'll essentially just be drones and just be pushed around and have their experience be dictated to them, and they lose control of their life. A loss of egalitarianism, and I don't. That is a real thing. I don't want to be dismissive of that, because it's conceivable at some level. I mean, it's definitely conceivable. But at the same time, I don't think it should be overstated. I don't think we're in a place. That's really an Orwellian vision, and I would never suggest that we could never get to an environment where there are harms and a place where we wouldn't want to live, right? And practices we wouldn't want. I would never say that that's inconceivable, but we're not. I don't think we're there now. I don't think we're that close to getting there. I don't think we can lose sight of people's abilities to make decisions for themselves. I mean, and part of this comes down on how different people would govern, and it almost becomes a political thing. Like, how much responsibility do you leave to individuals, and how much do you place to governments to try to make everything fair, right? And everybody's experience equal. But it's never been that way, to be honest. I mean, the world has never been a fair place. And that's one of the things that's a bit challenging and kind of unfair. The notion that, like, oh, with technology, we'll just start making everything fair, and things were never fair. Unfortunately, things haven't been fair in this country, and they never will be, so the notion that they just became unfair now with data collection is misguided. I mean, depending on where you were born and how much money you had and were born with, and the people around you and your school system and your influences, and those of us who have studied a lot of policy and sociology and psychology recognize that life hasn't been inherently fair, and it can't be. It's inconceivable, But that said, it wouldn't be good to have entities that have governments or private sector entities that have too much knowledge and knowingly prey on people who are in a bad position. And we know in our code, actually, we a fundamental element of our code that we added years back gets to this. We have a flat out prohibition for NAI members to use data that they collect for advertising purposes to make eligibility decisions. This is a part of these are decisions that are impactful for instance, lending or housing or education or healthcare, insurance. Those very important decisions that are made that really impact people's lives. Our members are not allowed. It's a higher bar. They're not allowed to use this data in a way that could impact those decisions. So I mean, and that's been our approach all along. So getting to your question and the notion of loss of autonomy, well, if you're using data to market black handbags versus brown handbags, or men's shoes versus women's shoes, or even an ethnic product, or a food type or something that someone may like, so you're collecting data, or you're making assumptions. You're not even usually collecting the data, but making assumptions that this person likes this, they might like that. That's not inherently a bad thing, but if you were to take certain data and determine people that have lower income, and then market payday loans to them, well, that's not great, but that's going to happen anyway, because those people are going to have billboards, near their house anyway, and they're going to have payday lending shops near their house, so it's not like, to be clear, we're already doing what we can to prevent those bad practices. There's always going to be some bad actors and bad practices, and even when you take the data and the technology out of it. But so we're mindful of that, and we've been focused on that, and we've had that prohibition for a long time, and it's one of the reasons we're proud. We've impacted a lot, and we've really worked, and we've really raised the bar. So now we're all focused on, okay, how do we keep raising the bar? And so there's this term that you may or may not have heard of called dark patterns, which is a recent term, only a couple of years old, really, that pertains to manipulative user interfaces that kind of coerce or mislead individuals, and ultimately get them to make decisions or do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So it's a bit tricky to define. I think it's very much akin to the FTC's authority under their Section 5 of the FTC Act around deceptive and unfair practices. Deception's, not allowed under Section 5, and the FTC can enforce around that. But dark patterns are a little bit more broader. The unfairness prong of the FTC Act is not quite as easy to enforce. They ultimately have to have a deception claim in most cases to be able to bring an unfairness, and they do struggle a little bit, but they have a lot of current authority, and frankly, most of the stuff that we're seeing in the marketplace is deceptive and unfair, and the FTC has brought a number of claims and is doing a pretty darn good job. And they've had a recent workshop on this topic and are exploring it. And it's something that we're focused on, and are working up some best practices, and are going to be trying to educate our companies about their practices. I mean, most of the dark patterns discussion is around things that are, again, a little outside of our space, that are more harmful, preying on people by kind of coercing them into make purchases they wouldn't have made, or putting extra stuff in the shopping cart, or tricking them into signing up for a subscription that they didn't know about and paying in perpetuity. And most of the practices are along those lines, and they're kind of, it's like digital swindling. It's trickery, but there's also a focus on our industry and how data is collected, and the notice and choice models that consumers deal with. And so that's an area where we feel like we can be really helpful in helping companies make sure they're not actively seeking to trick people into giving their data. But ultimately, more importantly, though, if the data is used responsibly, and there are parameters around the data use, and they're responsible companies, the fact that the data is collected isn't harmful in and of itself. And that's something that, we don't ever want anyone to lose sight of. So it's not like, some people just think like, oh, all data collection is bad, 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 bad. And if you believe that, then almost everything, that's going on the internet is bad. And it's like, and it's unwanted, and it should stop. And there's nothing we can do about people who feel that way and are just, some people inherently believe that it's just unsafe and bad and scary, and data shouldn't be collected. It just needs to be, kind of locked down. But that's not the future of the world. That's not the present. And I don't think there's many people that kind of view a future like that, especially when they learn more about it as something they want. I mean, there so many of these products and services we have are driven on data in so many ways, and they're monetized by data-driven advertising, as I mentioned. So I think the vast majority of people, policymakers, businesses want to be able to leverage the data, and the key is to enable that in a responsible way, and to be able to go after the bad actors and punish them, and so that's kind of where that's where our focus is, and ideally we'd have a piece of federal legislation to do that, to make these parameters, to provide for a stronger regulator, giving the FTC more resources and authority because they've got like nothing, they have like, they're super smart. The FTC is incredibly smart on this. The staff there know their tech and they know what's going on. There's just frankly not many of them for the scale of data collection and such, and potential and actual privacy harms. So for them to kind of sift through everything, they're a bit overwhelmed. And I think there's broad agreement that we need a strong federal regulator. So there'll be more of these conversations around dark patterns and kind of the technology interfaces that really do matter.
It's funny you say that. I've been wanting to talk to you about dark patterns for a while. I had no idea what they were, so it's interesting. And we sort of walked into it, or I stumbled into it, and got a little brief understanding of what it is. We have to bring you back for a larger conversation around dark patterns because it sounds fascinating to me, just as a concept. It's funny. The reason I actually raised the question I did was because I just interviewed Alan McKay, who's actually a ethicist in Sydney, and he's working with a group in Colombia right now, and they're looking at neuroscience. Essentially, what they're noticing, apparently in Colombia, they've managed to do this, is they've managed to get a mouse to see something that isn't there. So they're injecting thoughts into mice at this moment. So, and I compared that sort of to Inception, and the idea that you can plant a thought. Most people would know what that thought is, but Inception, obviously, the whole point was that they didn't. But if we can get that to that point with mice, how far away are we really with planting thoughts in humans around advertising? Look how great you'd look with this new pair of shoes, or whatever it is that you were going to do. So I just thought it was an interesting concept to play with. But as you pointed out, it's not something we're looking at the next year and a half, 2 years, even 5 years, 10 years. But we have the initial germ of a concept there. And I just didn't know if anyone had even begun thinking about it. Apparently, Chile and Spain are in the very, very early stages of conceptualizing this thought. But we'll sort of stay in touch, see what happens. But I had promised that I was going to keep you on here for only about 15 to 20 minutes or so. We're already at nearly double that. So I want to be very respectful of your time. This was incredible. So thank you so much for coming on. Do you mind if we ask a couple of questions?
Sure thing.
Okay. First question. Based on what we talked about, what is a question you'd like to ask the audience?
I'd just love to know from them how they feel about digital advertising and whether or not they actually get any benefits from it. I think they do, but whether or not they recognize that and whether or not they actually like it, because some people do like advertising that's more relevant. Our research shows that consumers are sometimes quite pleased when they see something like, wow, that's a great product. I was looking for a cooler. It's so hot out and I needed like a really good cooler, and I just found this one, so that's great. And, that's something that I think is out there. We think is out there. It shows up in some research. So I'd love to know that. And, I'd love to get any feedback from any of the viewers about, to learn more about the concerns and, do they feel better, understanding that their data is driving, this advertising, which is paying for these products and that they're getting. So it's great to be able to hear feedback on that if consumers kind of recognize that and how they feel about it.
So I usually take a chance to at least answer it the way I would if I was asked that question. So I'll answer that question. I think I enjoy when an ad is very, very specifically targeted to me based on almost a like I wouldn't have been able to piece it together, but somehow someone knew that that's the direction I want to go. Oddly, that's super creepy, but I find that to be really valuable because it's something that tells me what my next thought process should be. The ones that are I went to this website, you saw this ad, and now here's another one. That I find unnecessary and sort of pushing the boundary. Like, I already know where I want to go. I'm not sure that's helping me. But the one that I get a really uh, I enjoy the ads that are completely mistargeted at me. So those give me a secret thrill because it tells me that the algorithm hasn't completely figured me out. So if it shows me, uh, I don't know, a bikini for whatever, and you're going, that can't be targeted to me. Like that's just wrong. Um, the idea of I'm the target audience for that. So I enjoy the idea of throwing the algorithm off a little bit. So that's where I see. So I recognize the value. I do like knowing that I'm not completely figured out. And yeah, that would be my answer to that. I do like to ask two more questions, if you don't mind. The first being this month, and I recognize the month has just started, but what have you learned this month that has some value to you?
Yeah, this month, or maybe going back a little bit of a way. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've learned just the last couple of months about the value of the pharmaceutical industry. Some of us are,
Oh, you mean COVID? Okay.
yeah, are kind of skeptical, and here we are now, and looking at the benefits our nation's been able to have, and kind of coming out of this deadly pandemic, and having a lot of hope and reality to kind of turn the corner and get back to normal. There's some real good stuff going on. I guess I'm kind of feeling like that. I feel like I've learned that's pretty impressive. I don't know.
I'm fascinated by that because for me, and again, I'm not asking a follow-up question. Mostly, I'm just fascinating because what I'm hearing you really say is that before that, that's not what you saw. So to me, that's a really interesting perspective. Like, I wonder what he thought before then. But definitely something I'd love to explore next time as well. And then the second question was in the last week, and I mean, in the last week, what was the most memorable part of your job?
In the last week, well, I got to go on a business retreat, which was, again, seeing people for the first time, a bunch of people hadn't seen, and getting together and having real conversations the way we used to, and kind of actually sitting back and having some side conversations. And that to me was just, great. And I don't know that I'll probably remember that forever, coming out of a pandemic and being working out of my house, for over a year, and then like being able to go back and be like, oh my God, yeah, this is great. It's valuable to be able to talk to these people. This is fun. Like, so that's definitely nice.
Very, very cool. Going to do a quick summary of what we spoke about during our conversation. We talked a little bit about your role at NAI, how NAI itself evolved from being a self-regulatory organization for over 20 years to what you guys are now doing, which is around co-regulation, which we're going to talk about hopefully next time. I discovered that you've been with NAI for 3 years. I actually had a bunch of questions about that, but we just went a different path. And then we spoke about the difference of the two types of law, being the proactive versus the reactive, and NAI being a small organization, you're mostly in the reactive space. We spoke about the importance of consumer privacy, but how you are at this moment shaping, or at least help shape, the state regulations, state laws, by saying we really recommend going towards a more federal policy for all the advantages that it has. But the reality is that you often land up having to guide them in a position or into something that they already have, or that they can mimic or pull from, and that often lands up being something like CCPA. And again, feel free to let me know if I misunderstood that. But we then spoke a little bit about Apple versus Facebook and what the distinction is, first party versus third party ads. We then talked about fee-based apps, and that might be the cost of the quote unquote gain of privacy, if you will. And we talked about the distinction between advertising versus nudging. And I kind of, on one hand, it seems so cool to talk about it, but the point you made was it's a little bit too soon to talk about it because we aren't anywhere close to actually having that happen. The nudging obviously happens, but there's no real true loss of autonomy yet. And then I talked about my little conversation with Alan McKay. And then finally, we landed up talking very briefly around dark patterns. Did I miss anything?
I think that's a pretty good summary. You did a good job.
Good. I do have a question, David. Where can people reach you if they have questions?
At the NAI, David at networkadvertising.org. I think I'm reachable via our site, Network Advertising Initiative. And always happy to engage or to do education or to help people understand the process. That's really our job.
Perfect. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me at Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. David, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me, Darshan. Nice to talk.
Pleasure.
Take care.